On a cold January morning in 1947, a frail old man sat alone in the darkness of a grand bedroom. Outside, the River Rouge churned through the grounds of an estate that had once been the envy of America. The mansion around him was freezing. Its heating system failed, its rooms lit only by flickering candles and kerosene lamps. The electricity that had once made this home a wonder of the modern age had been knocked out by a flood, leaving the richest man in America to spend his final hours in conditions no different from the 18th century. That man was Henry Ford, and the house dying around him was Fair Lane, the estate he had built to celebrate his triumph over the old world. In the end, the old world had won. But to understand how a temple of innovation became a tomb of regret, we must travel back to a time when one man believed he could engineer not just automobiles, but the very fabric of American life. In the summer of 1863, while the Civil War raged across a fractured nation, a boy was born on a farm in Dearborn, Michigan. His name was Henry Ford. The world he entered was one of horses and hand tools, of candlelight and coal stoves. His father, William Ford, was an Irish immigrant who had carved a modest farm from the Michigan wilderness. His mother, Mary Litigott Ford, was the gentle heart of their household, a woman who believed her son was destined for something extraordinary. Young Henry hated farming. The endless labor, the stubborn earth, the slow rhythm of seasons. He looked at the horses pulling plows and saw inefficiency. He watched his mother struggle with household chores and imagined machines that could do the work for her. While other boys dreamed of adventure, Henry dreamed of gears and pistons. His mother recognized something different in him. She encouraged his curiosity, gave him pocket watches to disassemble, and never scolded him when he returned from the fields with grease-stained hands and a head full of mechanical drawings. She was his first believer, his earliest champion. Then, when Henry was just 13 years old, everything changed. Mary Ford died during childbirth, taking with her the only warmth their farmhouse had ever known. The boy who would one day build an empire was left alone with a grief he never fully processed and a father he could never please. Years later, Henry Ford would say that the house he grew up in died the day his mother did. He carried that loss like a stone in his chest for the rest of his life. And when he finally had the power to build his own home, he would try, in his own strange way, to bring her back. After his mother's passing, young Henry threw himself deeper into machines. They were predictable. They made sense, unlike people, unlike death, unlike the hollow silences that filled his childhood home. At 16, he walked away from the farm and into the noise and promise of Detroit. The city was transforming. Factories belched smoke into skies that had never known industry. Foundries cast iron into shapes that would have seemed magical just a generation before. Henry found work as an apprentice machinist, learning to coax metal into precise forms. He worked 16-hour days, slept in boarding houses, and spent every spare moment studying engines. By his 20s, he had become an engineer for the Edison Illuminating Company, rising to chief engineer by 1893. He was making a comfortable salary, earning the respect of his peers, and had married a young woman named Clara Bryant, whom he called the Believer because she never doubted his wild dreams. But Henry Ford was not satisfied with comfort. Late at night, in a small brick shed behind his rented home, he worked on something that most people thought was impossible. A horseless carriage powered by gasoline. A machine that could replace the animals he had always resented. On a rainy night in June of 1896, Henry Ford rolled his first automobile out of that shed. It was crude, noisy, and barely functional. He had to knock out the shed's door frame because he had forgotten to make the doors wide enough. but it worked. The quadricycle, as he called it, sputtered down the streets of Detroit at 20 miles per hour, terrifying horses and pedestrians alike. Henry Ford had built his first machine. Now he would build an empire. The early 1900s were a time of experimentation and failure for Ford. His first two automobile companies collapsed. Investors grew impatient. Critics called him a dreamer, a tinkerer who would never amount to anything. But Henry Ford had a vision that went beyond what anyone else could see. In 1903, he founded the Ford Motor Company with a handful of investors and a burning conviction. Other manufacturers built cars for the wealthy, handcrafted machines that cost as much as houses. Ford wanted to build a car for ordinary people, a machine so affordable that the workers who built it could buy one themselves. In 1908, he introduced the Model T. It was simple, reliable, and priced within reach of the American middle class. It came in any color you wanted, as long as you wanted black. And it changed everything. To produce the Model T at prices no one thought possible, Ford pioneered the moving assembly line in 1913. Workers no longer walked to the car. The car came to them. Each man performed a single task, over and over, as the chassis moved past on an endless chain. A car that once took 12 hours to build now took 93 minutes. Production exploded. Prices dropped. By 1918, half of all cars in America were Model Ts. Henry Ford had done what he promised. He had put the world on wheels. But there was a cost to this efficiency that few understood at the time. The assembly line transformed workers into human components, each one as interchangeable as the parts they installed. The creativity and craftsmanship that had defined American labor were replaced by repetition and speed. Ford paid his workers well, famously announcing a $5 workday in 1914, more than double the average wage. But he demanded total control in return. Ford's factories were monitored by a sociological department that investigated workers' home lives, their spending habits, their morals. Employees who drank, gambled, or lived in ways Ford disapproved of could be fired. The man who preached freedom through automobiles ran his company like a benevolent dictatorship. As his wealth grew beyond anything he had imagined, Henry Ford began to think about legacy. He had conquered industry. Now he wanted to conquer something more permanent. He wanted to build a home that would stand as a monument to his vision, a place where past and future could meet in perfect harmony. He would call it Fair Lane. In 1915, Henry Ford purchased 2,000 acres of land along the River Rouge in Dearborn, just a few miles from the farm where he had been born. The property included forests, meadows, and the flowing waters of the Rouge, which Ford planned to harness for power. He hired architect William Van Tyne to design a mansion worthy of his ambitions. But this would be no ordinary country estate. Ford wanted Fair Lane to be a technological marvel, a showcase of the innovations that had made him rich. At the same time, he insisted that it reflect his roots, his connection to the land, and the simple values he believed defined true American character. The result was a contradiction wrapped in limestone. Construction took 2 years and cost over $2 million, an astronomical sum in that era. The mansion rose 56 rooms across 3 stories, with facades of gray Indiana limestone that gave it the appearance of an English manor transplanted to the Michigan woods. But behind those traditional walls, Fair Lane was anything but traditional. The estate had its own power plant, a miniature version of the hydroelectric systems Ford admired. Water from the River Rouge spun turbines that generated electricity for the entire property. The mansion had electric lighting, electric heating, and one of the first residential telephone systems in America. There were refrigerators when most homes still used iceboxes. There were vacuum cleaners built into the walls. There was an indoor swimming pool with heated water. Ford also installed an elaborate intercom system that allowed him to communicate with any room in the house. He could check on his wife, summon servants, or monitor activities throughout the estate without ever leaving his study. It was efficiency applied to domestic life. The same principles that had revolutionized his factories now shaping his home. The grounds were equally ambitious. Ford built artificial lakes, hiking trails, and over 500 birdhouses to attract wildlife. He imported plants from around the world and employed a team of gardeners to maintain the elaborate landscaping. The estate became a private nature preserve, a controlled wilderness where Ford could escape the pressures of his empire. Yet for all its technological wonders, Fair Lane was designed around memory. Ford placed the mansion on a hill overlooking the spot where he had played as a child. He preserved the old trees his mother had loved. In the gardens, he planted the same flowers that had grown around his childhood home, flowers he remembered her tending in the years before she was taken from him. Fair Lane was not just a house. It was an attempt to rebuild the world as it had existed before loss, before industry, before everything changed. Henry Ford was trying to go home. Clara Ford, Henry's wife of over 50 years, made Fair Lane a true residence. While Henry obsessed over machinery and efficiency, Clara focused on warmth. She chose fabrics and furniture that softened the mansion's industrial bones. She filled rooms with fresh flowers from the gardens. She hosted dinners and gatherings that brought life to spaces that might otherwise have felt like museums. Clara was the quiet force behind Henry's success. She had believed in him when he was a penniless dreamer tinkering in a backyard shed. She had endured years of uncertainty while he struggled to build his company. And she had stood by him even as his fame brought complications she never anticipated. Their marriage was complicated. Henry was often absent, consumed by his work or his increasingly strange obsessions. He could be cold, distant, and stubborn to the point of cruelty. But Clara never wavered. She understood something about her husband that few others did. Beneath the genius and the arrogance was a wounded boy still mourning his mother, still searching for the warmth that had been stolen from him too young. At Fair Lane, Clara tried to create the home Henry had lost. She maintained routines and traditions that anchored their lives. Sunday dinners, holiday gatherings, quiet evenings by the fire where they would sit together, sometimes talking, sometimes simply existing in the same space. These moments were the closest Henry Ford ever came to peace. But peace was not something Henry Ford could sustain for long. His mind was always racing, always seeking the next innovation, the next crusade. And as his power grew, so did his darker impulses. The 1920s should have been Henry Ford's golden age. His company dominated the American automobile market. His personal fortune had swelled to unimaginable heights. He was celebrated as a folk hero, the farm boy who had outworked and outwitted the Eastern establishment. Presidents sought his counsel. Newspapers hung on his every word. But something was changing in Henry Ford. The same mind that had revolutionized industry now turned toward targets that had nothing to do with automobiles. In 1920, Ford purchased a small weekly newspaper called the Dearborn Independent. Within months, he transformed it into a platform for hatred. The paper published a series of articles attacking Jewish people, blaming them for everything from banking corruption to the decline of American values. These were not subtle accusations. They were virulent, hateful screeds that would later be cited by some of history's darkest movements. Ford distributed the Dearborn Independent through his car dealerships, forcing salesmen to sell subscriptions alongside Model Ts. At its peak, the paper reached nearly 1 million readers. The articles were collected into a book called The International Jew, which spread Ford's poison around the world. Why did Henry Ford, a man who had achieved everything through innovation and hard work, turn to such ugliness? Historians have debated this for decades. Some point to his rural upbringing and the prejudices common in that era. Others suggest his success had made him arrogant, convinced that his genius in one field qualified him as an expert in all others. Still others see a man growing old and fearful, lashing out at changes he could not control. Whatever the cause, the damage was profound. Ford's anti-Jewish campaign legitimized hatred for millions of Americans. His name and reputation gave credibility to conspiracies that would fuel atrocities across the ocean. When the darkness finally came to Europe in the 1930s, some of its architects kept portraits of Henry Ford on their walls. At Fair Lane, the sociological department's methods were expanded. Ford became increasingly paranoid about loyalty, surrounding himself with yes men and firing anyone who dared to disagree. He hired a brutal security chief named Harry Bennett, who enforced Ford's will through intimidation and violence. The River Rouge plant, once a symbol of American progress, became a place of fear. Ford's own son, Edsel, bore the brunt of his father's cruelty. Edsel was everything Henry was not: refined, artistic, diplomatic. He understood that the automobile industry was changing, that Ford Motor Company needed to evolve to survive. But every time Edsel tried to modernize the company, Henry blocked him. The father who had once defied convention now demanded absolute obedience from his own child. The conflict between them played out in the halls of Fair Lane, in boardrooms, and in the pages of newspapers. Edsel's health deteriorated under the stress. His father's constant criticism wore him down, body and soul. In 1943, Edsel Ford died of stomach cancer at the age of 49. Many believed the true cause was a broken heart. Henry Ford never recovered from his son's death. Though he rarely spoke of his grief, he retreated further into the past, into memories of a simpler time that may never have existed. Fair Lane became less a home than a fortress, its aging owner increasingly isolated from the world he had helped create. The 1930s brought crisis to America and to Fair Lane. The Great Depression devastated the automobile industry. Ford Motor Company, which had once seemed invincible, lost billions of dollars and fell behind competitors like General Motors and Chrysler. Henry Ford, who had always prided himself on paying high wages, was forced to lay off tens of thousands of workers. At the River Rouge plant, tensions exploded. Workers, emboldened by the growing labor movement, demanded the right to organize. Ford resisted with characteristic stubbornness, deploying Harry Bennett's security force to break up union meetings. In 1937, a group of union organizers were brutally beaten in what became known as the Battle of the Overpass. Photographs of the violence shocked the nation and turned public opinion against Ford. Eventually, Ford was forced to allow unionization, a defeat that wounded his pride deeply. The man who had once been celebrated as a friend of the working man was now seen by many as a tyrant who had to be forced to treat his workers fairly. At Fair Lane, the cracks were becoming visible. The mansion's advanced systems required constant maintenance, and wartime shortages made repairs difficult. The power plant that had once been Ford's pride began to fail. The gardens that Clara loved grew wild in places as staff was reduced. Henry Ford himself was failing. A series of strokes in the early 1940s left him weakened, his legendary mind clouded. He became confused, forgetful, prone to wandering the grounds, muttering about the past. The man who had once commanded the attention of nations now struggled to remember the names of his grandchildren. Clara watched her husband's decline with quiet anguish. She had spent her life supporting his dreams. Now she could only make him comfortable as those dreams faded into confusion. She kept Fairlane running as best she could, maintaining the routines that had always structured their lives. But she knew the end was approaching. On April 7, 1947, the River Rouge flooded its banks. Water surged through the grounds of Fairlane, knocking out the power plant that had supplied electricity to the estate for over 30 years. The mansion went dark. Servants lit candles and brought out kerosene lamps, the same sources of light that had illuminated Henry Ford's childhood home. That night, Henry Ford lay in his bed, 83 years old and fading. Clara sat beside him, holding his hand as she had held it through decades of triumph and tragedy. Outside, the river that had powered his home now surrounded it, as if nature itself was reclaiming what industry had borrowed. At 11:40 that evening, Henry Ford's heart stopped beating. He died in darkness, in a house that had gone cold, surrounded by technology that no longer worked. The man who had ushered America into the modern age left it by candlelight. His funeral drew thousands of mourners to Detroit. Presidents sent condolences, newspapers published tributes. The assembly lines at Ford Motor Company fell silent for the first time anyone could remember. Whatever his faults, and they were many, Henry Ford had shaped the 20th century more than almost any other individual. But at Fairlane, the silence that followed was different. It was the silence of abandonment. After Henry's death, Clara Ford remained at Fairlane, tending to the home she had made for over 3 decades. She walked the same halls, sat in the same rooms, and maintained the rituals that had defined their life together. But without Henry, Fairlane felt emptier than its 56 rooms could contain. Clara survived her husband by only 3 years. She passed away in September of 1950, and with her death, the last living connection to Fairlane's golden age was severed. The Ford family faced a difficult decision. The mansion was expensive to maintain and held painful memories. The power plant that had once been a marvel now required constant repair. The elaborate systems Henry had installed were decades out of date, more trouble than they were worth. In 1951, the family donated Fairlane to the University of Michigan, hoping the institution would preserve Henry Ford's legacy. But the gift came with complications. The university struggled to find uses for the aging mansion. The costs of maintenance drained budgets meant for education. For years, Fairlane existed in limbo, neither fully abandoned nor truly alive. Parts of the estate were demolished. The swimming pool, once a symbol of Ford's wealth, was filled with concrete and converted to storage. Rooms were divided by temporary walls. The gardens that Clara had loved were reduced to a fraction of their original glory. Fairlane became a shadow of itself, a monument slowly crumbling from neglect. In the 1970s, concerned citizens formed the Fairlane Foundation to preserve what remained. Restoration efforts began, slow and underfunded, but persistent. The power plant was stabilized. Key rooms were returned to their original appearance. Tours brought visitors through the halls where one of America's most complicated figures had lived and died. Today, Fairlane stands as a historic site, open to visitors who want to understand the man who built it. The mansion has been partially restored, its limestone facades cleaned and its most significant rooms preserved. The power plant, now recognized as an engineering landmark, can still generate electricity from the waters of the River Rouge. Walking through Fair Lane today is a strange experience. There is beauty here, undeniable beauty. The woodwork, the views, the integration of architecture and landscape all reflect genuine artistry. But there is also unease. Knowing what Henry Ford believed, knowing the harm he caused, complicates any appreciation of his achievements. The tour guides speak carefully, acknowledging both the innovations and the darkness. They point out the technological marvels while noting the troubling history of the man who commissioned them. Fair Lane has become a place for complicated lessons, a reminder that greatness and terribleness can exist in the same person, sometimes in the same room. Perhaps that is the most important thing Fair Lane can teach us. We want our heroes to be simple, to be purely good or purely evil. But Henry Ford was neither. He was a genius who changed the world and a bigot who spread hatred. He was a devoted husband who built a home for the woman he loved and a cruel father who broke his own son. He was a champion of workers who violently suppressed their rights to organize. Fair Lane holds all of these contradictions within its walls. It refuses to let us simplify the man who built it. And in that refusal, it becomes something more valuable than a mere historic site. It becomes a mirror, reflecting the complexity of human nature itself. The River Rouge still flows through the grounds of Fair Lane, just as it did when Henry Ford was a boy playing along its banks. The water that once powered his dreams and flooded his final hours continues its ancient journey toward the lakes and eventually the sea. Some days, when the light falls just right and the wind carries the scent of the gardens Clara planted, you can almost imagine what Fair Lane must have felt like in its glory days. The hum of machinery from the power plant, the laughter of guests at one of Clara's dinners, the footsteps of a man who believed he could bend the world to his will. But then the shadows lengthen, and you remember the rest. The hatred published in the Dearborn Independent, the workers beaten at the Battle of the Overpass, the son who was never good enough, the darkness that grew alongside the light. Fair Lane was built as a monument to American innovation. It became, in the end, a monument to American contradiction. The same nation that celebrates individual achievement also harbors individual cruelty. The same person who lifts millions up can push many down. The same technology that liberates can also control. Henry Ford died believing he had lived a good life. Perhaps he did, by his own strange accounting. He had risen from poverty to unimaginable wealth. He had transformed transportation, manufacturing, and American culture itself. He had built a home where he could be close to the memory of his mother, where he could pretend that the boy who lost her had somehow found his way back. But Fair Lane tells a more complicated story than the one Ford wanted to tell. Its empty rooms and aging systems, its beauty and its shadows, its restored grandeur and stubborn decay, all speak of a legacy that cannot be simplified. In the end, maybe that is exactly what we need. Not heroes, but humans. Not fairy tales, but history in all its messy, painful, inspiring, terrible truth. The mansion still stands above the River Rouge. The water still flows, and the questions Fair Lane raises about progress and prejudice, about genius and cruelty, about the homes we build and the ghosts that haunt them, remain as urgent as ever. Henry Ford once said that history is more or less bunk. But walking through Fair Lane, you realize he was wrong. History is the story of who we were, and therefore who we might become. It is the foundation on which we build, whether we acknowledge it or not. Fair Lane is that foundation made visible, a house of wonders and horrors, of love and loss, of light and darkness. It asks us to look, to learn, and to decide for ourselves what kind of future we want to build on the ruins of the past. The candles that lit Henry Ford's final hours have long since burned out, but the questions they illuminated still flicker in the shadows of Fair Lane, waiting for anyone brave enough to seek answers in the dark. Standing in the Great Hall of Fair Lane today, you can feel the weight of all that happened here. The limestone walls, quarried from Indiana and fitted by craftsmen whose names are long forgotten, still carry the marks of their labor. The oak beams overhead, cut from forests that have since been replaced by suburbs and shopping centers, still hold the ceiling against time and gravity. But it is the silence that strikes you most. In a house built to demonstrate progress, to showcase the future, there is now only stillness. The machines that once hummed with purpose are museum pieces. The rooms that once echoed with conversation are empty except for tourists speaking in whispers, as if afraid to wake something sleeping in the corners. Henry Ford designed Fair Lane to last forever. He built it from materials that would outlive generations. He powered it with a river that had flowed since before humans walked these lands. He filled it with technology meant to prove that the old ways were finished, that the future belonged to those bold enough to seize it. And yet, the power plant sits quiet now, its turbines still, its generators cold. The water of the Rouge flows past without purpose, no longer needed to light the halls or heat the pools. The intercom system that once let Ford monitor every corner of his domain has been disconnected, its wires cut, its speakers silent. Technology ages faster than stone. Innovation becomes obsolescence in a single generation. The cutting edge of 1915 is the antique of today. Henry Ford built his temple to progress on foundations that progress itself would undermine. There is a lesson here, perhaps the most important lesson Fair Lane can teach. We build monuments to our achievements, believing they will stand forever. But everything we create is temporary. The river outlasts the turbine. The forest outlasts the factory. Time outlasts us all. Henry Ford spent his life trying to control the uncontrollable. He systematized labor until workers became extensions of machines. He monitored his employees' personal lives as if he could engineer morality. He built a home that merged past and future, trying to freeze time in a moment that suited his vision. But time cannot be frozen. It flows like the Rouge, relentless and indifferent, carrying away everything we build and everyone we love. Henry Ford's mother died when he was 13, and no amount of success could bring her back. His son Edsel died under the weight of paternal disappointment, and no apology could undo the damage. His own mind failed him at the end, leaving him confused in a house he no longer recognized. Fair Lane stands as a reminder that even the most powerful among us cannot outrun mortality. We can build mansions, we can accumulate fortunes, we can bend industries to our will, but we cannot hold on to anything forever. The only question is what we do with the time we have. Henry Ford's answer to that question was complicated. He created jobs for millions and spread hatred to millions more. He empowered workers with high wages and terrorized them with surveillance. He loved his wife with genuine devotion and failed his son with spectacular cruelty. Fair Lane holds all of these truths simultaneously. It does not resolve them into a simple verdict. It simply presents them, carved in stone and echoing in empty rooms, and asks us to make what sense we can. If you visit Fair Lane on a spring morning, when the gardens are just beginning to bloom and the river runs high with snowmelt, you can understand why Henry and Clara loved this place. The beauty is real. The peace is tangible. The connection between the mansion and its landscape feels deliberate and earned. Clara Ford planted thousands of flowers here, varieties chosen to bloom in succession so that something would always be in color from April to October. She designed walking paths that revealed the grounds gradually, leading visitors through sequences of discovery. She understood that a home is more than walls and ceilings. It is the experience of moving through space, the way light falls through windows, the sounds and smells that accumulate over years of living. The gardens have been partially restored, though they will never match Clara's original vision. The roses that once climbed the pergolas have been replanted. The artificial ponds that Ford commissioned have been cleaned and restocked with fish. Nature is returning to Fair Lane, not as Ford intended it, but as nature intends itself. There is something hopeful in that return. The gardens that industrialism built are now sustained by volunteers and nonprofit organizations. The technology that has replaced Ford's innovations runs on different principles, solar panels and sustainable practices instead of hydroelectric dams. The future that Fair Lane was meant to represent has given way to a different future, one that Ford himself might not have recognized. Perhaps that is how it should be. Each generation must build its own monuments and learn its own lessons. We inherit the achievements and the failures of those who came before us, but we are not bound by their choices. Henry Ford's vision shaped the 20th century, but it does not have to shape the 21st. Fair Lane invites us to study the past without being trapped by it, to learn from Ford's innovations while rejecting his bigotry, to appreciate Clara's gardens while acknowledging the wealth that paid for them, to walk through rooms designed for a world that no longer exists and imagine the world we want to create. The tour ends in the basement of Fair Lane, in the powerhouse that was once Henry Ford's proudest achievement. The massive generators sit silent now, their brass fittings polished to a shine that recalls their glory days. Informational plaques explain how the system worked, how water from the Rouge was channeled through penstocks to spin turbines that produced enough electricity to power a small town. It was, by any measure, an engineering triumph. Ford had harnessed nature itself to serve his needs, turning flowing water into light and heat and motion. He had built a home that was independent of the electric grid, self-sufficient in ways that most modern homes still cannot match. He had proved that the same mind that designed automobiles could design anything. But the plaques also note what the triumph cost. The dam that Ford built altered the ecology of the Rouge, changing water temperatures and disrupting fish populations. The industrial processes that created his wealth poisoned the very river he claimed to love. The progress he celebrated came at prices that only later generations would fully understand. Standing in the powerhouse, surrounded by the machinery of another era, you realize that every innovation carries hidden consequences. The automobile freed Americans from the limitations of distance, but also created pollution, urban sprawl, and a dependence on fossil fuels that now threatens the planet. The assembly line made products affordable, but also made work soul-crushing. The technologies that Fair Lane showcased transformed daily life, but also enabled new forms of control and exploitation. We cannot go back. The world Ford helped create is the world we inhabit. But we can go forward with greater awareness of the trade-offs we are making. We can ask, before we innovate, who will benefit and who will pay the price. We can remember that progress is not automatically good, that every step forward must be judged by its effects on all people, not just those at the top. Fair Lane does not preach these lessons. It simply presents the evidence and lets visitors draw their own conclusions. The beautiful home of a brilliant monster, the technological marvel powered by a poisoned river. The monument to progress that stands as a warning about the costs of progress. That is the genius of historic sites like Fair Lane. They do not tell us what to think. They show us what happened and trust us to find the meaning ourselves. The sun sets over Fair Lane most evenings without audience. The tourists have gone home, the staff has locked the doors, and the mansion returns to the silence that has been its primary resident for decades. In the fading light, the limestone facades take on a golden glow that almost erases the years. You can squint and imagine smoke rising from the chimneys, lights flickering in the windows, the sound of laughter drifting from the terrace. You can pretend, for just a moment, that Fair Lane is still alive. But then the darkness comes, and the pretense fades. The mansion stands alone, as it has stood alone for longer than it was ever inhabited. The ghosts of Henry and Clara, of Edsel and the grandchildren who visited here, of the servants and gardeners and all the lives that passed through these grounds. These ghosts have nothing left to haunt. What remains is stone and wood and glass. What remains is the River Rouge, still flowing, still carrying its waters toward the sea. What remains is the question that Fair Lane has always asked, silently, persistently, through every season of its existence. What do we do with what we inherit? Henry Ford inherited the Industrial Revolution and transformed it into something no one had imagined. He also inherited the prejudices of his era and amplified them beyond reason. He built and he destroyed. He loved and he hated. He was brilliant and he was blind. We inherit all of it. The automobiles and the assembly lines, the minimum wages and the labor surveillance, the technological marvels and the ecological damage, the vision and the hatred. Fair Lane does not tell us how to sort through this inheritance. It only insists that we try. It stands as a monument to complexity, a refusal to simplify the past into comfortable narratives. It demands that we look at everything, the beauty and the ugliness, the genius and the cruelty, and decide for ourselves what to carry forward and what to leave behind. That is the work of every generation. To inherit, to judge, to choose and to build. To make something new from the materials of the old while learning from its mistakes. The River Rouge will keep flowing long after Fair Lane has crumbled. The land will keep changing, as it has changed since glaciers carved these hills thousands of years ago. Nothing human lasts forever. Not mansions, not fortunes, not even ideas. But the questions last. The questions about how to live, how to use power, how to treat others, how to face our own mortality. These questions echo through Fair Lane as they echo through every life, waiting for answers that each of us must provide. Henry Ford died by candlelight in a house built to celebrate electricity. Perhaps there is no better symbol for the limits of human ambition. We reach for the future with all our might, and the past pulls us back. We build monuments to permanence, and time reduces them to dust. We believe ourselves masters of our fate, and fate reminds us otherwise. Fair Lane stands at the edge of the River Rouge, a reminder of all we can achieve and all we cannot escape. It is beautiful and it is terrible. It is history made visible in all its contradictions. Visit if you can. Walk the halls. Study the machinery. Wander the gardens that Clara loved. And when you leave, carry the questions with you. They belong to all of us now. The story of Fair Lane is the story of America itself. Ambition and cruelty. Innovation and exploitation. Dreams built on foundations that cannot hold. We are still writing that story. Fair Lane reminds us that every chapter matters, that the choices we make today will echo through the halls of history, waiting for future generations to judge. May we build better than Henry Ford. May we love more freely and hate less fiercely. May we leave behind monuments that our descendants can admire without shame. The river keeps flowing, the sun keeps setting, and Fair Lane keeps waiting, patient as stone, for us to learn its lessons at last. But before we leave this place, there is more to see, more rooms to explore, more stories hidden in the corners that the standard tour never visits. Deep in the basement of Fair Lane, beyond the famous powerhouse, there is a network of tunnels that most visitors never see. Henry Ford built these passages for practical reasons, to move supplies without tracking mud through the main house, to allow servants to travel unseen between buildings. But the tunnels also reveal something about the man who commissioned them. Ford was obsessed with control, not just control over his factories and his workers, but control over every aspect of his environment. The tunnels allowed him to manage Fair Lane like a machine, with inputs and outputs carefully regulated, with nothing left to chance or chaos. Even his home operated on principles of efficiency. The tunnels connected the main house to the powerhouse, to the garage, to various outbuildings scattered across the grounds. Servants could carry food from distant kitchens without exposing it to weather. Maintenance workers could access pipes and wires without disturbing the family above. Everything functioned according to a system, a design, a plan. But systems break down. Plans fail. And the tunnels that Ford built to control his world eventually became symbols of his declining grip on it. In his final years, confused by strokes and overwhelmed by changes he could not understand, Ford would sometimes wander into these tunnels and get lost. Servants would find him standing in the dim passages, uncertain which direction led home. There is something deeply sad about that image. The man who had engineered the modern world, lost in the infrastructure of his own creation. The master of efficiency, unable to navigate the systems he had built. The titan of industry, reduced to a confused old man in a dark corridor. Fair Lane's tunnels are closed to the public now, deemed unsafe for tours. But they remain, threading beneath the grounds like veins beneath skin. They are part of the house's skeleton, invisible but essential, holding together a body that has long since stopped breathing. Above ground, the estate's other buildings tell their own stories. The garage, built to house Ford's growing collection of automobiles, was designed with the same care as the main house. Its limestone facades matched the mansion. Its proportions echoed the architectural themes that Van Tine had established. Even a building for cars was meant to be beautiful. Ford kept dozens of vehicles here over the years. Model Ts, of course, but also prototypes and experimental designs that never reached production. He would sometimes spend entire afternoons in the garage, tinkering with engines, adjusting carburetors, returning to the hands-on mechanical work that had defined his early career. The garage was his sanctuary, a place where the complexities of running an empire could be reduced to the simple satisfaction of making something work. Clara rarely visited the garage. It was Henry's space, masculine and utilitarian despite its elegant exterior. She had her gardens and her parlors. He had his machines and his motors. Their marriage was a partnership of separate domains, overlapping in the shared spaces of the main house but otherwise distinct. The greenhouse complex, by contrast, belonged to Clara. She had commissioned glass structures to house exotic plants that could not survive Michigan winters, orchids from South America, citrus trees from Florida, tropical flowers that filled the air with perfume, even as snow piled against the windows outside. Clara spent hours in these greenhouses, working alongside gardeners who came to respect her knowledge and dedication. She was not a dilettante playing at horticulture. She studied plants seriously, corresponded with botanists, and experimented with cultivation techniques. The greenhouses were her laboratory, her art studio, her escape from a husband whose moods could darken entire rooms. Most of the greenhouses were demolished after Clara's death, victims of the same budget pressures that stripped Fairlane of so many features. But one structure remains, restored and replanted, offering visitors a glimpse of the tropical paradise Clara created in the heart of industrial Michigan. Walking through that surviving greenhouse today, surrounded by plants that have no business growing this far north, you can feel Clara's presence more strongly than anywhere else on the estate. This was her domain. These were her choices. The colors, the arrangements, the specific varieties that she selected and nurtured. They speak of a woman determined to create beauty in defiance of circumstance. Henry Ford may have built Fairlane, but Clara Ford made it a home. The relationship between Henry and Clara deserves more attention than history has typically given it. They were married for 59 years, longer than most marriages last, through periods of struggle and triumph that would have destroyed weaker bonds. What held them together? Love, certainly. The letters they exchanged when separated reveal genuine affection, a warmth that contradicts Henry's public image as a cold and calculating industrialist. He called her the believer not just because she believed in his inventions, but because she believed in him, in the person beneath the persona, in the wounded boy who had never stopped mourning his mother. Clara saw Henry clearly, more clearly than anyone else. She knew his flaws, his prejudices, his capacity for cruelty. She did not excuse them, but she did not abandon him either. Her strategy was influence rather than confrontation. She shaped his decisions subtly, steering him away from his worst impulses when she could, accepting his stubbornness when she could not. It was Clara who finally convinced Henry to stop publishing the Dearborn Independent in 1927, after lawsuits and public pressure had made continuing untenable. She had opposed the paper from the beginning, understanding that its hatred contradicted everything she believed about fairness and decency. Her persistence, quiet but relentless, eventually prevailed. But even Clara's influence had limits. She could not protect Edsel from his father's criticism. She could not prevent the labor violence that stained the family's reputation. She could not halt the decline that age and illness brought to the man she loved. Some battles are unwinnable, even for the most determined fighters. At Fairlane, you can see the traces of their partnership in the design of the house itself. Henry's influence is obvious in the technological systems, the power plant, the intercom, the innovations that made the mansion a showcase of progress. But Clara's influence is equally present in the warmth of the interiors, the flow of the rooms, the integration of gardens and architecture that softened industrial precision into something livable. They built Fairlane together, even if they rarely spoke about it in those terms. The house was their collaboration, their shared achievement, the physical manifestation of a marriage that endured everything the 20th century could throw at it. When Clara died in 1950, 3 years after Henry, the collaboration ended. The house they had built together became something else, a historical artifact, a burden to be managed, a problem to be solved. Without its creators, Fairlane lost its purpose. But perhaps that is not entirely true. Perhaps the purpose shifted rather than disappeared. Fairlane was built to showcase one man's vision of the future. Now it serves a different purpose, to help us understand the past, to learn from both the achievements and the failures of those who came before. To remember that every choice has consequences, and that the monuments we build outlive the intentions we build them with. The estate covers approximately 1,300 acres today, significantly less than the 2,000 Ford originally purchased. Development has encroached from all sides, subdivisions and commercial strips pressing against the historic boundaries. The River Rouge that once flowed through wilderness now flows through suburbs. The isolation that Ford sought has long since disappeared. But within those remaining acres, something of the original vision survives. The forests that Ford preserved still stand. Older now, their canopy thicker, their undergrowth wilder. Deer still wander the grounds. Birds still nest in the hundreds of birdhouses that Ford commissioned, though many have been replaced by modern reproductions. The landscape retains a sense of separation from the world beyond, a feeling that you have stepped outside ordinary time. That feeling is Fair Lane's greatest gift. Not the architecture, impressive as it is, not the technology, obsolete as it has become, but the experience of walking through a place where someone tried to hold time still, to preserve something precious against the forces of change. We all try to do this in our own ways. We keep photographs and mementos. We maintain traditions and rituals. We tell stories about the past, hoping that memory can defeat mortality. Henry Ford did what most of us cannot. He built a physical monument to his desire for permanence. And yet the monument itself proves that permanence is impossible. Fair Lane has changed despite every effort to preserve it. The systems have failed. The people have departed. The original purpose has been replaced by new purposes that Ford could never have imagined. Change is the only constant, even in places designed to resist it. That is not a sad conclusion. It is simply the truth. And there is a kind of peace in accepting truths that cannot be changed. Fair Lane teaches us to build anyway, to create beauty even though it will fade, to love even though we will lose, to strive even though we will fail. The mansion stands not as a proof of victory over time, but as an act of defiance against it, a declaration that some things are worth doing even when they cannot last forever. Henry Ford was a complicated man who built a complicated house. His legacy includes both the automobiles that transformed American life and the hatred that poisoned American discourse. His home includes both technological marvels and quiet spaces for grief. We do not have to choose between condemning and celebrating him. We can hold both truths simultaneously, as Fair Lane itself holds them. We can learn from his innovations while rejecting his bigotry. We can admire his determination while mourning its victims. That is what history asks of us. Not judgment in simple terms of good and evil, but understanding in all its difficult complexity. The past is not a morality play. It is a record of human beings making choices, some wise and some terrible, in circumstances that shaped and constrained them. Fair Lane preserves that record in stone and wood. It invites us to study it, to question it, to learn from it, and then it sends us back into our own lives, where we must make our own choices, building our own monuments, leaving our own legacies. The river flows on. The sun sets and rises, and somewhere, in the silence of Fair Lane, the questions wait for anyone willing to seek their answers. That is the story of Henry Ford's Fair Lane, a home built for love and haunted by darkness, a monument to progress that became a lesson in limits, a beautiful, terrible, magnificent, cautionary tale written in limestone and echoing through empty halls. May we learn from it what we can, and may we build better than those who came before.